Hello everyone, welcome to Conceptnomics. In this video, we'll be discussing about different types of deficits. If you remember, in the last few videos, we were discussing about the Union Budget 2024-25. And while discussing the budget, we came across different types of deficits, and I told you I'll be making a separate video on different types of deficits. Today, we'll be discussing different types of deficits. Let's get started. These are the different types of deficits one should know, and it's very important from the perspective of union budget or the government's expenditure or fiscal policy. So these are the four different types of deficits. First one is fiscal deficit, the second one is primary deficit, third one is revenue deficit, and the fourth one is effective revenue deficit. So as we move forward, we'll see and discuss what are these different types of deficits. Now, before we move into the definition of each type of deficit, I thought that I'll show you an illustration to make it more clear so that the concept is better understood for you. So, for that, let us take this figure. This is actually a screenshot from the document Budget at a Glance. So, in this page, you will see that there are different heads like revenue receipts, and within revenue receipts there is a tax revenue, non-tax revenue, all these things are there. So from here we will see what are the different types of deficits. Now if you see the ninth one, that is total expenditure. If you take the ninth one, that is the total expenditure. And then here we have eighth one, that is total receipts. So here you will see that the total receipts and the total expenditure, that is the eighth and the ninth subjects here, the items here on this list are equal. The numbers are equal. So that means the total receipts of the government is equal to the total expenditure of the government. So what does this mean? It means that whatever is the total expenditure of the government, the same will be the revenue of the government, and that's how a budget should be. That is, in a budget, there are two sides. One is the expenditure side and another one is the revenue side. So in a budget, the expenditure side and the revenue side should always be equal. Both should be equal, only then we can call it a budget, a balanced budget. So for that purpose, it should be the same. So that's why the budget deficit will always be zero. So this is the first point that you should understand. That is, the budget deficit will always be zero in any budget. Why? Because the expenditure side and the revenue side will be equal. That's what we see here. The eighth and the ninth item, that is total expenditure plus total receipts, both are the same. Now the question is, if the total receipts and the total expenditure are the same, does it also mean that the government is earning as much as it is spending? You need to understand this question very well. The question here is whether the government is earning as much as it is spending. So to understand that, we have to search for an item here, that is the borrowings of the government. Now to understand borrowings will come under the seventh item, that is borrowings and other liabilities. So if you see the seventh item, you will see that borrowings and other liabilities, which means government has also borrowed some money, and this borrowings has come under capital receipts. So borrowings are a part of capital receipts. Now let's come back to receipts. We know that receipts are of two types. One is revenue receipt, another one is capital receipt. So revenue receipt plus capital receipt equal to total receipts of the government, which means if you take the item number 8, that is the total receipts, it is a sum of revenue receipt and capital receipts, which is given here, that is total receipts equal to 1 plus 4. 1 is revenue receipt, 4 is capital receipt. And now within the capital receipt, we have an item called as borrowings and other liabilities, which is a part of capital receipt. Now, see, total receipts and total expenditure is the same, but here the point is that within the total receipts, there is an item called capital receipts, and within the capital receipts, there is something called as borrowings and liabilities. Now, we can sum this into one single point, that in order to meet the total expenditure, government has borrowed some money, or in other words, we can say that in order to equalize total revenue and total expenditure, government has borrowed some money in order to meet the expenditure. Now, what is this borrowings? So, from this borrowings, we get an idea about the fiscal deficit of the government. I hope this concept is clear for you. Now, the first point that we have discussed is regarding budget deficit, which we said will always be nil or zero. Why? Because in a budget, it is always a point that the total receipts and the total expenditure will be equal. That is what makes budget deficit zero. Whereas we also said that within the total receipts, we have something called as capital receipts, and within capital receipts, we have something called as borrowings and other liabilities, which means that the government has borrowed some money in order to meet the total expenditure or equalize the total receipts and total expenditure. I hope this idea is clear. Now, with this idea in mind, let us go back to the topic fiscal deficit. Okay, so fiscal deficit. Fiscal deficit is the difference between a government's total revenue and total expenditure in a financial year except borrowings. So here we said that total receipts will always be equal to total expenditure. Whereas fiscal deficit, when we write the formula of fiscal deficit, it is equal to total expenditure of the government minus total receipts except borrowings. Except borrowings. So this is the definition for a fiscal deficit. Now from this definition, what you can conclude is, if fiscal deficit is total expenditure minus total revenue except borrowings, fiscal deficit will also be equal to the borrowings that has been made by the government to meet the budget expenditure. Which means if there is a shortage or if there is a deficit in the budget, government will borrow money in order to meet the expenditure, and this borrowings will be equal to the fiscal deficit of the government. So a fiscal deficit can be incurred when a government spends more than it earns or when its revenue falls short of its expenditure. So when for example, let us take an example to understand it better. Suppose the expenditure, budget expenditure or the total expenditure of the government in the budget is, let us take a value of 1000 crore, and let us take total revenue of the government in the budget is only 800 crore, which means there is a deficit of 200 crore. How will the government meet this deficit? Government will borrow money, right? So this borrowing will be equal to the fiscal deficit. So this borrowing will be equal to the fiscal deficit, or we can say whatever money is in short, that will be the fiscal deficit of the government. I hope this is clear for you. Moving on to the next deficit, that is primary deficit. Now, primary deficit equals fiscal deficit minus interest payments. Now, let's come back to the illustration again. Alright, so now we are going to discuss about the primary deficit, and by formula we know that primary deficit is equal to fiscal deficit minus interest payments of the government. Now see, we have fiscal deficit which is shown as item number 17, here item number 17, then interest payments of the government, which is item number 11. Now, when we subtract the interest payments of the government from the fiscal deficit, we get primary deficit. And what is the importance or the relevance of finding primary deficit? See, for that we need to understand what is the relevance of this interest payment. Now, when we say the government has a particular sum of money which goes as interest payment, an expenditure which is paid as interest, it means that the government has a lot of previous loans or borrowings. So, or there is a backlog of liabilities for the government. If the government is spending some money on interest payment, it means that in the previous years, government has borrowed money from external and internal sources, and for which the government is paying interest. Which means the debt liability of the government is very high. The debt of the government is very high. Now, when we find primary deficit, we get an idea if there was an absence of interest payments or if there was no liability of interest payments for the government, what would be the money that the government would have actually required to meet the current year's budget expenditure. I hope it is clear. The interest payment is not something that you are spending for current year expenditure. It is the money that you are spending because you have a backlog of liabilities or because you have borrowed money in the past. Okay. So, if there was no such obligation, what would be the actual money that the government would have needed to meet this year's budget expenditure is what the primary deficit will throw light on. And that's the relevance of primary deficit. And with that in mind, let us go back to primary deficit definition. Primary deficit equals to fiscal deficit minus interest payments, and this indicates the gap between the government's expenditure requirements and its receipts, not taking into account the expenditure incurred on interest payments on loans taken during the previous years. This is what we said. If the government had no liability of paying interest for the loans that has been taken in the previous years, what would have been the money that the government would have actually required? So this is the formula for primary deficit. And moving on, next one is revenue deficit. Let's again understand through the illustration. Okay, now coming to revenue deficit. Revenue deficit here, it is item number 15. And revenue deficit simply is the difference between revenue receipts and revenue expenditure. So, revenue receipts, revenue deficit is equal to revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. This is revenue deficit. Now, we know that when we say revenue expenditure or revenue receipts, when we say revenue, it is of short term in nature. Alright, so revenue expenditure refers to those expenditure which the government incurs to meet the day-to-day expenditure or for the working of the government, like for example paying salaries, pension, all these are revenue expenditure for the government, whereas revenue receipt means the receipts that belongs to the government and which need not be actually paid back, that is which belongs to the receiver. So, government has many heads under revenue receipts, like tax is a form of revenue receipt or the fines collected, all these are revenue receipts. So, when we subtract revenue expenditure and revenue receipts, what is the sum that you get? That is revenue deficit, which means if a government has a revenue deficit, the conclusion or what we can sum up is, if a government has a revenue deficit, it means that the government is unable to meet its revenue expenditure, which is the day-to-day expenditure from revenue receipts, which is a very bad signal regarding the working of the government. Why? Because see, let us take a micro example. For example, you receive some money or you receive some revenue every month in your family, and you also will have day-to-day expenditure in your family. So if you're not able to meet your revenue expenditure or day-to-day expenditure from the money that you earn, what does it mean? Your management, financial management is not good, and assume that you are taking a loan in order to meet your day-to-day expenditure, not for creation of capital assets, not for buying a car, not for buying a house or nothing like that, but simply for meeting your day-to-day expenditure. If you are taking a loan, it means that your financial situation is very bad or your financial management is very bad, and that's the same with the government. And if a government is not able to meet its daily expenditure, day-to-day working expenditure, that is the revenue expenditure from the revenue receipts, it shows that it's not a good sign. All right, so the difference between revenue expenditure and revenue receipts is what we call as revenue deficit, and according to the FRBM Act, we have to reduce the revenue deficit to zero. That's the target we have. We will be discussing about FRBM in detail later in a different video. So this is revenue deficit. I hope it's clear for you. Revenue deficit. And when we discuss about revenue deficit, we should also discuss about effective revenue deficit, which is an even more important type of deficit from your examination perspective. Now, we said that revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts will give you revenue deficit. Now here the problem is that there are different type of revenue expenditure for the government. So the government incurs various types of revenue expenditure, out of which one revenue expenditure is the grants given by the central government to the state government for the creation of capital assets. Be very clear, grants given by the central government, because we are discussing about the union budget. See, we are discussing about union budget, and in union budget all the expenditures of the central government is shown. So under the union budget, under the revenue expenditure head, there are various expenditures, and one such expenditure is the grants given by the center. Center gives various grants to whom? To the state governments, state. And what is the purpose of this grant? To create capital assets, or for capital expenditure, or for the creation of capital asset. Okay, let's not get confused. Let's write it as capital assets only. If I write expenditure, it may get confused. For the creation of capital assets. Okay, to make it more clear, I'll just give you an illustration. Why are grants revenue expenditure? As we said, once the grant is given to the state government, it belongs to the state, and that's why it has a revenue nature, and also it's an expenditure for the center, and it's shown in the revenue expenditure side of the union budget. Now let's take for example, the central government is giving maybe 1,000 crore rupee grant to the state of Andhra Pradesh. Let's take for example Andhra Pradesh, and this grant will be used by Andhra Pradesh for the creation of a capital asset. Let's take for example a road. A new road is being built in Andhra Pradesh, and for that purpose the center is giving Andhra Pradesh some grant. Okay, now Andhra Pradesh has used this money to create a road, construct a new road, and this road is a capital asset. All right, you know that road building, all these things are capital assets. So Andhra Pradesh used this money to create a road, construct a new road, which actually is a capital expenditure. Even though the center has shown this as a revenue expenditure, and it's really a revenue expenditure for the central government, the purpose, or maybe we can say that the nature of that expenditure is capital. Alright, and Andhra Pradesh being a part of India, being a part of the union government or the Union of India, we can say that this new road has added to the overall assets of the country itself. Alright, so this has a capital nature. So this expenditure is revenue, but such expenditure, revenue expenditure, which has a capital nature, but this expenditure has a capital nature because it has created a capital asset. So what do we do is, from the revenue deficit we deduct such type of expenditure. That is, from the revenue deficit we reduce grants given to the state government for the creation of capital assets. And when such type of grants which has a capital nature, but those are revenue expenditure, that is grants to states for the creation of capital assets, is reduced from the revenue deficit, we actually get effective revenue deficit. So this is effective revenue deficit. Now let's go back to the definition. Revenue deficit, it's the excess of government's revenue expenditure over revenue receipts. That is simply revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts will give you revenue deficit. This is a very simple term. Next one, effective revenue deficit. It's the difference between revenue deficit and grants for the creation of capital assets. That is, from the revenue deficit we are actually reducing those grants which are given to the states for the creation of capital assets, and then you get effective revenue deficit. So these are the important types of deficits. I hope this was a useful one. Thank you so much for watching.